This video is sponsored by my limited time merch. You can find links to them in the description. How's it going, everybody? Too spooky here. A while back, I made a video going over some interesting facts about Orihime that you may not have known, and in that video, I stated that I was going to make a video about her unique abilities in the near future. Now, a year and a half later, I'm finally making that happen. So I'm extremely sorry that it took so long, but let's finally talk about Orihime's powers and how they work. To start, I feel we should quickly touch upon how Orihime obtained these powers in the first place. Were her powers the result of encountering Ichigo's spiritual form? Is it a Fullbring? Where exactly did it come from? Well, the truth of the matter was actually revealed by Aizen while speaking to Isshin. He was explaining that the Hogyoku's true power is to capture and materialize the hearts and will of the things that exist around it. Basically meaning the Hogyoku can essentially grant abilities or even events based on its own will. Aizen then mentioned that Orihime and Chad's powers were the result of the Hogyoku granting them abilities because they resented their own lack of power. As we later learned, Chad's abilities were actually the product of Fullbring, but Orihime's powers are not Fullbring, and instead were actually granted from the Hogyoku itself. This right here could also be the reason Aizen chose to kidnap Orihime in the first place, so that he could examine a godlike ability granted from the Hogyoku, or maybe he just wanted to use that ability for himself. Either way, those are just mere possibilities. So now we know where her abilities actually came from, but now we need to discuss what these abilities are and how they work. The ability itself is called Shun Shun Rikka, which is comprised of 6 different spirits that reside within the flower hairpins her brother gave her. Orihime has 2 different pins with 6 petals on each, therefore the 6 spirits take up 2 petals each when they are not active. We'll go over each of the 6 spirits in a moment, but it should be noted that each spirit has its own unique personality, appearance, and abilities. With these spirits, Orihime has the ability to reject or undo various events or forms of matter. This rejection can be done in the form of offense, defense, or even healing. Each of these different rejections or techniques are also only possible with certain combinations of the 6 spirits, so each one serves its own unique purpose in the grand scheme of things. Before we go in depth with the specifics on what Orihime's powers are able to do, or what she is able to reject, we first need to go over the 6 spirits. The first spirit is named Shun'ō, and the second spirit is named Ayame. These 2 spirits work together to manifest Orihime's healing techniques. The third spirit is named Lily, the fourth spirit is named Bagon, and the fifth spirit is named Hinagiku. These 3 spirits work together to manifest Orihime's defensive techniques. The final spirit is named Tsubaki. Tsubaki is the only spirit with offensive capabilities, and in general, the power of his attacks are reflected by the amount of anger or killing intent Orihime has at that moment. Although, because Orihime is naturally against fighting herself, and she has a very timid nature, Tsubaki's attacks usually aren't very powerful. It should be noted that these spirits appeared in their spirit forms quite a bit at the beginning of the series, but as the series progressed, we saw them less and less, until they ultimately just stopped appearing altogether. So it's pretty likely that Kubo originally wanted to incorporate their personalities into Orihime's abilities a lot more when he first introduced them, but later on he just kinda pushed them aside to be completely forgotten about. Which is kind of a shame, because I've always thought that the multiple spirit aspect of her abilities was pretty interesting. At least, to me, it was a lot like a Zanpakuto spirit, but multiplied by 6. Which kinda makes it even more disappointing when you realize that Zanpakuto spirits were a pretty prominent feature all the way until the end of Bleach, but Orihime's Shun Shun Rikka spirits were just completely trashed. Her spirits were technically still there, of course, whenever Orihime actually uses her abilities, as she couldn't even use her abilities without them in the first place, but they just never appeared in their spirit form after a certain point. But I guess this could also have something to do with the focus on Orihime being pushed aside in general. When the spirits are active, but not in their spirit form, I also need to mention that they take the form of what looks like origami paper airplanes? or at the very least, that's what they always looked like to me personally. I really don't know how else to describe their appearance. The spirits themselves can also be injured, and therefore will not function until they are healed. We really only saw this with Tsubaki, as he kept getting injured because of Orihime's timid nature, but it was something I needed to at least mention regardless. It's unknown if Orihime would still be able to use her healing abilities if Ayame or Shun'ō were to be injured, because if they were injured and could therefore not function, Orihime would no longer be able to reject time, and there would really be no way for her to heal them, unless of course these spirits could heal themselves after an extended period of time. Another potential weakness to these spirits would be the fact that when they are inactive and in hairpin form, they are literally as weak as the hairpin itself, meaning that if someone were to simply break the hairpins while the spirits were inactive, Orihime could very well lose her powers completely. But now that we know each of the spirits and the role that they play, let's talk about Orihime's various techniques and what exactly they do. The first technique we're going to discuss is Soten Kishun, which is her healing technique. To activate it, Orihime calls upon Shun'ō and Ayame, who will then create an oval-shaped barrier around whoever Orihime chooses. The barrier will then reject any destruction or past events of anyone behind the barrier, essentially meaning this ability is able to heal any wound by returning a person to a state where they were not injured. One example being when she completely reconstructed Grimmjow's arm. So although it appears as though she is actually healing someone, she's instead just reversing or rejecting their wounds completely to a point where they didn't exist, which could also technically double as a time reversal technique. Orihime is also able to control the size of this oval barrier at will, making it as big or small as she needs to cover the injured areas. While it does have its limits, we have seen that she is able to make it big enough to heal up to 2 people at once. Although this power was compared to that of a god by Aizen, it still has limits to what it can do, mainly in the fact that it cannot resurrect the dead, basically meaning it does not have the ability to reject death or restore life. So bottom line, so long as the individual is still living, Orihime is able to restore their body to a previously uninjured state, no matter what happened to them to cause those injuries in the first place. The second technique is called Santen Kishun, which is her defensive technique. To activate it, Orihime calls upon Lily, Bagon, and Hinagiku, who will create a barrier in the shape of a triangle whenever Orihime so chooses. Much later on in the series, Orihime is also able to shape this ability into a large dome, which contained up to 8 people, including herself. This technique is a lot more straightforward than the last one, in the fact that it will simply reject any attack that touches the shield. So essentially, any attack that touches the shield will not hit whomever or whatever is behind it. Because this shield is essentially supposed to reject any harm, it can also double as a cushion of sorts when it comes to large falls, basically meaning Orihime can fall from a large height, but save herself so long as she lands on the barrier instead of the ground. It's unknown if this ability has a limit in terms of times it can be used, size it can be, or damage it can reject, but we have seen that Ichigo was able to crack it while using his Fullbring. So it's possible that with more power behind an attack, the barrier could be broken. The third technique is called Koten Zanshin, which is her offensive technique. To activate it, Orihime calls upon Tsubaki, who will fly at her opponent with great speed and force. Now the trick of what makes this ability so powerful is how it rejects the fusion of matter itself. Essentially what Tsubaki does is he flies into the enemy, and after penetrating their body he creates a shield while inside. The shield will then reject the union of matter within that opponent's body, basically meaning it will split the enemy clean in two because it rejects the opponent's body from being connected in the first place. Tsubaki himself is actually very powerful in the fact that he is able to cut through any form of matter to get inside and put up this shield as well. But the only issue is that Orihime's dislike of combat hinders this ability's effectiveness like we kinda mentioned earlier. So if Orihime actually had some rage and a lust for battle behind her, she would potentially be able to defeat some of the strongest foes in Bleach. Because if Tsubaki is actually able to cut through anything like they say, she can basically take down anyone, so long as they aren't able to stop Tsubaki before he reaches them. So with that knowledge, I think it's safe to say that most people think Orihime is a lot weaker than she actually is, due to the fact she doesn't actually fight very much. But in truth, like I just explained, she's actually extremely powerful. While those were her 3 main techniques, she also has one combination technique called Shiten Koshun, which is a mixture of offense and defense. To activate it, Orihime calls upon Hinagiku, Baigon, Lily, and Tsubaki. But another thing to note would be the fact that Orihime no longer needs to use an incantation to use her abilities by the time she uses this ability in the series. The 3 defensive spirits create a triangle barrier like usual, but Tsubaki is integrated into the technique by entering the center of the barrier. Whenever the barrier is hit by an attack, Tsubaki will defuse the attack in an instant by condensing the force into an explosion, and then launch that explosion as a counterattack back at the enemy, which can easily injure the person who dealt the blow in the first place, especially at close range. Essentially mixing offense and defense by creating an explosive barrier. But that basically does it for Orihime's abilities and how they work. Hopefully you guys learned something new or found a better understanding of her abilities. If you did, make sure to drop a like. Also be sure to subscribe for future content, and while you're at it, be sure to comment what ability you would like explained next. Once again, I just quickly wanted to mention that we do have some limited time Christmas merch available until January 1st, so you can be spooky and festive at the same time. So if any of those look interesting to you, or you just want to support the channel with something cool in return, be sure to follow the links in the description. Sorry that this video took over a year and a half to actually come out. It's a project I've meant to tackle for a while, but I just kept pushing it further and further back as there were other things I wanted to tackle first, which actually happens quite often. So I am truly sorry it keeps happening, guys, but any promises I make for future content will happen eventually, even if it takes years. But now that the video is over, if you guys are looking for some more too spooky content, well, be sure to click here for that fact video about Orihime if you missed it, or click here for the top 10 Shikai in Bleach. Thanks for watching, see you next time everybody.